So what I want to do now, I want to turn our attention very quickly back to the matter of Israel. Now, last week's study in the book of Matthew, I had mentioned that Israel was given promises. Abram was given a promise in chapter 12 of the book of Genesis, verses 1 to 3, and that's where we get the I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and of you, or from you, through you, by you, the families of humanity will be blessed. So that's a way of saying Jew, Gentile, every person that will ever draw breath on this earth, because of you and what I'm going to do through you, is going to be blessed. Now, if you look at a secondary blessing that there is, he gives a different one at a different time, many years later, and it's going to be about his descendants and the land that he promises to them. And he makes it very specific. Of all of the children that Abraham had, and the most prominent among them would have been Ishmael, the firstborn, the promise that God gives is going to come through Isaac. And Isaac is not not Abraham's firstborn. Again, that distinction lies with Ishmael, but God is not blessing him with this eternal blessing. So you read chapter 15 and chapter 17, which we will get to in the coming weeks, and it becomes very, very obvious if we're just being honest with the text, and we're going to do that. We're going to take a number of weeks and just take it in bite-sized pieces. We're going to look at the promises and then ultimately how they are misunderstood even by people who try to quote the New Testament, Galatians 3 in particular. But what ends up happening is, in this question about the land and is Israel in the land because of some particular reason, is there a work that God is doing through them? Even that is now being debated in circles around, and because of social media, it's all over the place. So I want to take a look at that before we move on into the promises specific to Isaac, and the fact that God is still going to have something to do with the nation of Israel. Not all of the church agrees with this. And what I want to make sure we talk about and address right here today is that the argument that is now being made by many in the church as a way of attacking Israel. So there are the people who will it's a twofold type of a thing. They look at the modern state of Israel and they have a couple of problems with it. First of all, they don't see them as the rightful heirs to the land. And so they would say that basically that's because it's not some, supernatural hand of God kind of a thing. It's rather that the powers that be in the world kind of helped put it together. Financial people, New World Order kind of people, they point at people like the Rothschilds, they point at the United Nations and various declarations and all the rest. And it's really that the Jews were returned to the land by the powers that be and very influential people, but they're not God's people. They call themselves Jews and they're back in the land, but they're really not the supernatural hand of God. So the first way I like to be able to discuss that, I think it's important for us to be able to say, let's take that premise, that they're not God's people because they're only there because of secular reasons and kind of the machinations of man. That's who's brought them back. So if that's the case, that they really can't be God's people because it's not God who brought them back, but it's the United Nations and it's the very wealthy people that are just doing this, and there's all the reasons that they give for that. The conspiracy people love to point this out. And so that really kind of invalidates the fact that Israel has any rightful right to the land. So again, my question is, well, okay, I understand their point, but is that something that God would do and it's without some kind of precedent, that he would use other non-Jewish sources to return his people to the land? And that's the first part of this that I'd like to answer. So the very simple answer to that is, well, no, he's done this before. And the best, most obvious answer to that is what happened at the hands of the Persians when the time came that God restored them to the land after the Babylonian captivity into the Persians. So that's 70 years that God said that they would be sent away. Think Jeremiah 29 and into 30. And that God, after 70 years, which we're told at the end of 2 Chronicles 36 why it was. For 70 cycles, they had not given the land rest. So for 490 years, God said, on the seventh year, let the land rest. They didn't do it for 70 cycles. So when God finally judged them at the hands of the Babylonians, he sent them away for 70 years. But at the end of those 70 years, by this time, Babylon has been conquered, and the conquering king was a man known as Cyrus. God mentions him by name in the book of Isaiah. I think it's chapter 44. And so Cyrus is the one who ends up sending back Zerubbabel and the rest of the group that went back initially at the end of those 70 years. And he brought them back, and Cyrus paid for it. He commissioned it. He sent the people back. He was very much secular, and it was his money that helped to underwrite the project. So he sends back Zerubbabel and the rest of the group, and they begin to inhabit Jerusalem yet again. So the idea, first objection that we get oftentimes, is that it was secular sources and secular money and outside of Israel that ended up bankrolling it, and so it's just a modern incarnation of man's will. Well, God has done so before. He's used secular sources and secular money to do what he wanted done. Cyrus is your perfect example. Second part. Well, they're really not God's people because they live in a state of rejection of God, and that they're not following after their Messiah, and they've rejected Jesus. So therefore, that door is left open for the replacement theology people to say that Israel is abandoned, and because they rejected Jesus, all of the promises that were given to Israel have now been fulfilled in the church through Jesus Christ. We're going to get to that argument about replacement theology in weeks to come, but let's deal with the idea that they've come back in a place of unbelief. So the second of the objections that we get often is that God's brought them back into the land. Well, no, he couldn't have done that because they're in unbelief. They're not following Messiah. They're following the law, and not all of the country is actually, much of the country is even secular. And I don't refute any of that. But once again, do we want to believe for a moment that when God brought them back under Cyrus and Zerubbabel, that they were all coming back because they were devout believers and they were the only ones who were living there were devout and following God? Clearly not. Because even by the time that Nehemiah comes back, there is a whole bunch of rebellion that's been taking place for decades, and the whole of Jerusalem lay in a place of complete decay. So even though Zerubbabel was brought back, fulfilling the promise that God would bring them back after 70 years, they didn't have their act together with the Lord then either. So they were in places of corruption, and that's why you find that Nehemiah and Ezra institute enormous changes, getting them on their right walk with God again. That lasts only for a while, but clearly they were in the land and they were his people, and they were nonetheless, they were in a place of rebellion, which is also something that needs to get brought up in this discussion. When it comes to rebellion and the people's rebellion against God, the idea that somehow if they're not walking with God, they're no longer his people, well, that doesn't wash at all when you look at what we see in the Old Testament, where how many times were they led by very, very wicked people, and they themselves were doing incredibly wicked things. Looking at Ahaz, great example of that. When they were sacrificing their children, or as they did under Manasseh, same thing, sacrificing their children in the Hinnom Valley. Did they stop being God's people? No, because after Ahaz comes, we get Hezekiah, a godly man. After Hezekiah, you get Manasseh, who is unbelievably wicked, but then you get Josiah after him. So it's not as though when they're wicked and in rebellion that they quit being his people. So again, it just falls apart. These arguments fall apart under examination. Now, the other one that we get, and this will be the last one that we deal with today, we get to the point where people will say, yeah, but also they are corrupt and their leadership is corrupt, and they're just kind of playing the system, and nobody should be supporting them because of their corrupt government. Look at what they do, look at what they say, and all the rest of it. And so once again, I have to say, when we look at the kings that they had, and even the governments that they had when it was the judges, during the time of the judges, were they wicked, and were they corrupt, and were they doing awful things during Jesus' time? Again, did they stop being God's people when their whole leadership was corrupt and not walking with God, not even seeking him, but actually doing their own corrupt things? Of course. Were they trying to, impose their will wherever they could? Absolutely. They've done that through their history. But show me a single nation on earth that hasn't done that ever since their inception. And quit trying to put them in their own category. So this is the kind of stuff that we often hear, from the likely suspects that we hear. I kind of even hate to mention them by name, but we know who we're talking about. Just mentioning Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson and the people that they travel in. Those are the only two that I'll mention, because the rest of them, I don't even want to give them the attention by name. But it's the same thing. The Jewish lobby, we hear about that all the time, and all the rest of it. They're pointing to things that Charlie Kirk had said. But really, it's an interesting thing that he was being, if we believe the reports, he was beginning to be a little disgusted by the people who were supporting him and making demands on him. But the actions of some does not necessarily mean that it speaks for all of the people. So if you want to point to some lobby that there is somewhere in this country, or in trying to be involved in politics or whatever else, that doesn't mean that you're talking about the entirety of the people. Or if you're going to try to make that case, let's have two different categories here. There is that God has brought them into the land, and then there are also the people who were heading it up at the time. As it was that God had his people Israel in times past, there were times that they were led by very wicked people, but that didn't change the fact that they're his people. So there were promises that were made that God would restore them to the land. That's column one. Are they back in the land because God promised? The scriptures would tell us absolutely. So does that mean that because if there are somehow corrupt people in the government, that somehow that nullifies the first part, that God's brought them back to the land? Of course not. History would tell us otherwise. There is the fact that they are God's people. I don't see that there's any way that you can refute, if you're going to look at all of Scripture, that God has brought them back for this time. Is it any surprise that there may be corruption in the people at any given time? That's what you would expect, because you find it everywhere where man rules. But there are too many things in the Old Testament that say that God would restore them into the land, and that even in their corruption, there's going to be a very difficult time ahead of them. And if we believe what Zechariah tells us in chapter 13, some are going to turn to him, but most will not. And so the idea that he brings them back into the land just because they're his people don't mean that they have followed him or will in the future. We have their history of thousands of years. They never stopped being his people just because they were governed by wicked people. And God kept completely doing a rework in them again and again and again. And when I read the last couple, we'll finish with this. When I read the last couple verses, for anybody listening to this who wants to disagree with it, go back and read the last two verses found in the book of Amos chapter 9, and you will have to be honest. If you're going to be honest, you'll have to notice that that has never had a precedent where God reestablishes them, brings them back to the land, and not had them removed. So if Amos chapter 9 verses 14 and 15 are to be believed, and if we're going to take them literally, the only option we have before us is that God is reestablishing them in the land right here, right now. And the fact that they would have any kind of corrupt leadership, why would that be a surprise? Because the Bible tells us in the end of times that Jerusalem, once again, will be the center of everyone's attention, and Israel is where it all takes place. And a remnant will seek him out while most will go away into destruction. That's what Zechariah tells us. The culmination of all of what we see of those end times passages in the Old Testament, if we're faithful to the text and don't try to make it fit some other historical event, it has to be something future. And I believe that we've watched it take place in our day, and we're moving towards a time when they will once again be pressed, and the enemy will try to wipe them out yet again. They have been targeted throughout history, and that's not going to be undone anytime soon. So any questions on any of this? We can discuss it through email, or as you're going to see, this will be on the website, both at the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net, or on the YouTube channel. There's comments that are open there. So if you have any questions about it, contact me either through the website or make your comments in the YouTube channel. I do monitor those things, so any crazy off-the-wall things will be removed. I don't debate for the sake of debate. We can reason together, and if it gets really weird, I'll just remove it entirely. So, try to govern yourself. If not, I'll do it for you. So.